The myth of the monolithic past. The real Iron Age 1 Levant was not a black and white landscape of pious heroes and primitive villains. Instead, it was a messy, fragmented, and deeply fascinating crucible of competing cultures, shifting borders, and evolving theological ideas. The texts themselves hide the deep scars of centuries of editing, rewriting, and political spinning. By stripping away the modern gloss and the later theological revisions, we do not diminish the power of the story. Rather, we uncover the visceral, gritty reality of how ancient Israel actually came to be. Let us break down the popular myths and replace them with the startling discoveries of modern academic history. For generations, readers have approached the opening chapters of 1 Samuel as an absolute eyewitness account. We are taught to see a cohesive identity where every Israelite answered to the same high priest and marched under the exact same banner. But historical reality shows that the Highlanders of the 11th century before the Common Era were isolated. They lived in tiny clusters of small ridgetop villages, struggling day by day to survive the elements. The concept of a unified state was completely non-existent at this early stage of development. What we call early Israel was actually a loose confederation of distinct clans, often suspicious of one another. The neat tribal borders described in later books were an idealized projection created centuries after the fact. Therefore, our understanding of the entire era must be completely re-evaluated from the ground up. Act 2, Shiloh, the rustic shrine in the lost tabernacle. In popular tradition, Shiloh is presented as the majestic, undisputed spiritual heart of all Israel. It is depicted as a permanent, grand installation where the entire nation traveled annually to offer sacrifices at the tabernacle. We picture white stone walls, gold-covered altars, and massive crowds filling a vast sacred plaza. But archaeological excavations at the modern site of Khirbet Ceylon paint a drastically different picture. Excavations led by visionary teams like Israel Finkelstein reveal that Iron Age 1 Shiloh was not a massive, sprawling religious metropolis. It was actually a modest, relatively small highland settlement nestled awkwardly in the mountains. The site lacked the large-scale public architecture you would expect from a true national capital. Instead, archaeology reveals a humble collection of basic pillared houses and small storage complexes. These simple buildings were built directly against the older Middle Bronze Age city walls. While it is true that massive deposits of animal bones and cultic vessels have been uncovered, indicating a real sacrificial site, it was a regional shrine. It served the local hill country tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, not a centralized national sanctuary. Furthermore, the biblical text itself slips up and betrays its own later editing. While tradition insists the sanctuary was merely the portable wilderness tent of meeting, the Hebrew text of 1 Samuel repeatedly calls it a hekel. Hekel is a loanword from ancient Akkadian that explicitly means a permanent stone temple or a royal palace. The text even mentions permanent doorposts, structural gates, and individual sleeping quarters for the young priests. The idea that a grand, uniform wilderness tent stood there unchanged for centuries is an idealized retrojection. It was created by later writers who desperately wanted to harmonize the wilderness, wandering myths with the historical stone temples of the highlands. Archaeology does confirm a violent, fiery destruction layer at Shiloh, dating to the mid-11th century before the Common Era. This structural burning perfectly aligns with the timeline of a major regional conflict or a Philistine invasion. However, the historical Shiloh was a rustic, isolated mountaintop sanctuary. It was far removed from the grand, bustling temple complex painted by popular imagination. When you remove the theological exaggeration, you find a small, vulnerable mountain shrine that met a sudden, tragic end. Act 3, Reimagining the Enemy, the true identity of the Philistines. The word Philistine has entered the modern English vocabulary as a direct insult. It usually means an uncultured, unrefined person who hates art, philosophy, and sophistication. Traditional Sunday school lessons present them as a crude, heavy-handed group of coastal thugs who only knew how to fight. We see them as dirty, disorganized raiders who envied the spiritual purity of the mountain Israelites. Academic archaeology has completely turned this deep-seated prejudice upside down. The Philistines were actually part of the highly sophisticated Sea Peoples migration from the Aegean world. Modern genetic testing and ceramic analysis trace their roots back to mainland Greece, Crete, and Cyprus. When they settled on the southern coastal plain of Canaan around 1200 before the Common Era, they brought an advanced lifestyle. They brought a beautiful, urbanized Mediterranean culture that completely outclassed their neighbors. While the early Israelites were living in simple, scattered, unfortified villages in the rugged mountains, the Philistines were urban planners. They were building clean, meticulously laid out cities like Ekron, Ashdod, Gath, Gaza, and Ashkelon. Excavations at Tel Mikni Ekron reveal large urban centers with sophisticated industrial zones. They uncovered massive olive oil presses, beautifully plastered rooms, and complex public buildings. Their material culture was light years ahead of the Highlanders. They produced beautiful, delicate pottery known to specialists as Mycenaean 3C1b. This unique ceramic style featured elegant geometric patterns and stylized birds painted in rich red and black over a smooth white slip. They possessed superior metallurgical knowledge, holding a practical monopoly on iron smithing. This technological edge gave them an enormous military and economic advantage over the bronze-reliant Israelites. Their diet included fine wine and pork, and they utilized Aegean-style central hearths in their homes. These distinct domestic features completely set them apart from the local Canaanite and Israelite populations. The conflict described in the books of Samuel was not a battle between civilization and savagery. It was a classic economic and territorial friction between two completely different worlds. On one side was a highly advanced, urban, coastal civilization expanding eastward for new agricultural land. On the other side was a developing, decentralized group of rustic highland farmers struggling to defend their borders. Act 4, The Ark of the Covenant, a political weapon and an independent epic. In the popular version of the story, the Ark of the Covenant is a holy, magical chest. It acts like a divine radio tower for God's physical presence on earth. It brings instant, miraculous victory to the pure and terrifying, painful plagues to the wicked. Scholars view the Ark through a much more clinical, political, and historical lens. First, text critics have long recognized a structural anomaly in the text. 1 Samuel chapters 4 through 6, along with 2 Samuel chapter 6, form an isolated unit. Scholars call this unique segment the Ark narrative, or the Ladiersichtlang in German scholarship. If you read these chapters closely, you will notice a bizarre literary fact. The prophet Samuel completely disappears from the entire story for several chapters. The narrative flows perfectly from the Battle of Aphek to the travels of the captured Ark through Philistine cities. It follows the Ark all the way to its eventual return, without ever mentioning Samuel, Shiloh's destruction, or any spiritual reformation. By showing that the Ark had an independent, terrifying power that could humble even the great Philistine god Dagon, the writers were sending a message. They were justifying why this specific object had to be brought to David's new capital to cement his royal authority. Furthermore, anthropologically, the Ark was not unique to ancient Israel. It functioned exactly like an ancient Near Eastern war palladium. A war palladium was a sacred, portable box or shrine containing sacred divine symbols or stones. Nomadic and tribal societies regularly carried these shrines directly into the front lines of battle to ensure the physical presence of their deity. Similar sacred chests were used for centuries by pre-Islamic Arab tribes during long desert migrations. Ancient Egyptian reliefs even depict sacred barks containing divine images being carried into foreign warfare to terrify enemies. The traditional view treats the Ark as an abstract, purely unique spiritual relic. But history shows it was a concrete, highly charged political tool used to unify fragmented, bickering tribes under a single military banner. Act 5, Samuel the Man, the Legend, and the Redactors. In popular preaching, Samuel is presented as a flawless, monolithic figure. He effortlessly holds the offices of a supreme national judge, a miraculous prophet, and a high priest all at once. He commands kings, wins wars with simple prayers, and speaks for God with total absolute authority. However, when you look closely at the source layers of the text, a very different reality emerges. Samuel appears to be a complex, composite character woven together over centuries from vastly different oral traditions. Biblical scholars identify at least two, and possibly three, competing source layers in the narrative. In the oldest, pro-monarchic layer of the text, Samuel is not a grand national judge ruling from a seat of global power. He is described as a local, relatively obscure village seer, or diviner operating in the small district of Ramah. In fact, when the future King Saul goes looking for him in chapter 9, Saul has absolutely no idea who Samuel is. Saul only seeks him out because he lost his father's donkeys and needs a local clairvoyant to find them for a small fee of silver. This portrait contrasts sharply with the anti-monarchic, much later Deuteronomistic layer found in chapter 7. In that later layer, Samuel is suddenly transformed into a grand, sweeping national hero. He commands all Israel to gather at Mizpah and exercises absolute judicial authority over the entire regional territory. Why do these massive contradictions exist side by side in the text? The later writers of the Deuteronomistic history were working centuries after these events, during the painful Babylonian exile. They wanted to project a golden age of theological purity onto their distant past to encourage their broken audience. They took the historical memory of a local, highly respected holy man named Samuel and magnified him into a colossal, idealized leader. They wanted to show a profound lesson: when Israel listens to a perfect prophetic judge, the nation prospers and enemies fall. The real historical Samuel was far more localized, operating as a wandering circuit priest and seer in a small tribal territory. He spent his life navigating the dangerous, shifting waters of fractured tribal politics long before the concept of a unified nation ever truly existed. Act 6, the mirage of total victory at Ebenezer. The traditional story concludes chapter 7 with a triumphant, cinematic climax that seems definitive. Samuel offers a lamb, God thunders from heaven with a terrifying sound, and the Philistines are utterly crushed at the Battle of Ebenezer. The biblical text explicitly claims that the Philistines were completely subdued and did not enter the territory of Israel again all the days of Samuel. This presents a beautiful, clean picture of total military victory and immediate, lasting national peace. Yet the historical reality is completely exposed as a theological idealization by the very next chapters of the text itself. Just a few chapters later, when Saul is chosen as the first king, we discover that the Philistines are not subdued at all. In fact, they have deeply entrenched, oppressive military garrisons sitting right in the heart of Israelite territory. They control strategic mountain passes at places like Jibah and Michmash, keeping the Highlanders completely disarmed. Saul and his courageous son Jonathan have to spend their entire lives fighting a desperate, losing guerrilla war against an overwhelming occupation. If the Philistines were completely expelled and subdued by Samuel's prayers at Ebenezer, Saul's entire royal mission becomes completely redundant. There would be no reason to crown a military king to save Israel from Philistine oppression if the enemy had already been permanently crushed. Therefore, historians recognize that the spectacular victory at Ebenezer is a literary and theological construction. It was designed by ancient religious editors to make a profound theological point to their readers. They wanted to show that true national security comes from internal spiritual repentance and covenant faithfulness, not from physical weapons of war. The historical reality was a continuous, grueling, multi-generational border friction that dragged on for decades. Neither side achieved a clean, permanent victory until the centralized military reforms of David much later in the Iron Age. By comparing the glossy, traditional myth against the rugged, fragmented landscape revealed by archaeology, we discover a much richer history. We see a vulnerable, emerging group of hill country tribes slowly finding their cultural identity. We watch them wrestle with a highly advanced coastal neighbor and create a complex literary heritage to make sense of their survival. The true story of 1 Samuel is not a simple fable of magic relics and flawless heroes. It is the gritty, beautiful record of a people forged in the fires of conflict, writing their history to find hope in a chaotic world.